This is the Naked Mormon History Tour Travel Log, March 21st, 2017. Today I spent the majority of the day in St. George. There are quite a few hot spots around St. George, and there will be a few videos coming out about this. I began the day at the St. George Temple, which is an absolutely magnificent building. I couldn't get enough pictures of it. It's absolutely impressive. And the history behind that temple is quite fascinating, and I won't divulge too much because the videos coming out about the St. George Temple will illustrate much more. But it's a very impressive temple, and it was the first temple that was completed after the Nauvoo Temple, so the first temple under Brigham Young's rule. It wasn't the first announced. That would be the Salt Lake Temple, announced in 1847, if I'm not mistaken. That was had the groundbreaking ceremony in 1853, but was then completed in 1893, 40 years later. And if you look at the size and the magnitude of that temple, it makes sense that it costed the saints so much money and time in order to build it. But the St. George Temple was essentially what they did to hold them over. Now, people who are, have been in the church for a long time will probably say, can't believe you didn't know that. But this thing that I didn't know was there's no Moroni on the temple. And that absolutely blew my mind. I had no idea that there was a Mormon temple in existence, aside from Kirtland and Nauvoo, that didn't have a Moroni on it. But it turns out it's one of 6 temples that don't have a Moroni. In fact, the Salt Lake Temple was the first one to have a golden angel Moroni put on top of one of the spires. Really interesting. This temple just had a weather vane on top, an arrow. That's it. And I had to ask the guy at the visitor center why that is. And I don't think he didn't really answer why. He just said that Salt Lake Temple was the first one. The Logan Temple, it was dedicated before Salt Lake. It doesn't have a Moroni. And I think there were 3 other temples that were dedicated. Manti is one of them, I believe. And they all don't have angel Moronis on them. It was the Salt Lake Temple that had the first one. So I just thought that was a very fascinating detail of it. But I spent the early morning in the visitor center. I didn't go through a tour of the St. George Temple. I probably should have, but I spent the time in the visitor centers talking to the sister missionaries about this trip that I'm on, and about the temple, and about what they are doing in the church. And they recommended a few videos to go watch that are produced by the church, and I have yet to watch them. We'll see. But yeah, utterly fascinating stuff. But of course, after that, I went to the home of Brigham Young. And the Brigham Young home is something special. I'm trying to think of how to articulate what I'm thinking here. The Brigham Young home really goes to show how obsessively neurotic Brigham Young was with his possessions, as well as illustrates just how much power and wealth the man had. This was one of his many homes. I don't know the number of homes that Brigham Young had, but this was his summer home, and he stayed, I believe it was 6 winters, it was his winter home, because St. George is quite warm during the winter. Never getting below, 50 degrees or 40 degrees. I mean, it's an amazing place in Utah to spend the winter. That's why it's a retirement community. But Brigham Young spent his last 6 winters there in this winter home. And the utter opulence and beauty held in the walls of that home are just astounding. There's a story of a piano that Brigham Young wanted. One of his wives that was staying with him in St. George, the name escapes me. The sister missionary told me, I can't remember what her name was, but she was taking care of Brigham Young in his older age, and she was living in the house, and she was a wonderful piano player. And Brigham Young, because they're in Utah, they don't have any piano makers. They were more concentrated on survival than they were, typical staples of the incredibly wealthy. So Brigham Young had a piano, what was called a box piano, shipped from the East Coast over in one of the wagon trains. And the box piano is a piano that you can take the legs off, and it's a small box essentially, and then it makes it much easier for shipping. And of course, in those days, when you're shipping a piano across a country, it's necessary to have it be compact and whatnot. So they had a replica of that piano in there, and it was beautiful, an absolutely beautiful piano. But to speak more on Brigham Young's wealth and his I would say maybe his disconnectedness from the saints that were, suffering from food rationing and incredible lack of resources in St. George. Brigham Young had all of the wood in the house. It was all built with pine, because pine is the only thing that grows near St. George, and they had to go up to Cedar City to get most of it. And of course, in the surrounding foothills and whatnot. But because Brigham Young was a carpenter at a young age, he fell in love with exotic woods. But of course, in Utah, especially around St. George, you can't get, walnut and oak and these beautiful dark hardwoods shipped from somewhere without an incredible amount of cost. So what Brigham Young did was he had everything built out of pine, and then he had the carpenters in the home paint staining on the wood to make it look like it was a more opulent wood. But it wasn't just like, pine that was painted to look like pigeon blood agate and walnut and these dark, beautiful woods. It was also marble. There's a couple of mantelpieces that look like marble. But when you get up close to it, you realize it's just painted pine. It's just pine that they painted a marble-looking scape on. It's beautiful, but it does really illustrate the way that Brigham Young was able to throw around his power and get what he wanted out of the saints, or out of the situation, I say. And I guess the saints, their frustrations were just a byproduct of it, and their struggles that they went through. But to understand the rationing that they went through and the labor sharing that Brigham Young forced upon them in order to build the St. George Temple and his home and essentially establish St. George is utterly incredible. The whole thing is just quite fascinating. And then, of course, after that, I ended the day at the Jacob Hamblin home. Now, Jacob Hamblin is a bit of a legend in Mormonism. Okay, he was known as kind of a peacemaker. He was a diplomat to the Native American tribes in the area, and he was, among other things, he was an outlaw. He killed a lot of Native Americans, and there was this story. Now, this is a story from an elder missionary, and, the historicity of it, I'm sure, is quite disputed, so take it for what it's worth. But the story goes, Jacob Hamblin was the leader of a militia when he was living in Tooele, Utah. And the militias, the Mormon militias were there essentially just to fend off the United States government and the Native American tribes. So Jacob Hamblin and his troops were called out on a scouting mission or some kind of extermination mission or something relating to natives that were raiding the town in Tooele. And when it came to the confrontation, this is how the story goes. Jacob Hamblin pulled up his rifle to fire it at a Native American that was there, and the gun misfired. And Jacob grabbed his gun to look at it and try and mess around with it to get the firing cap or on there, or, to reset the flint or whatever to see if he could get it to fire. And at that time, the native that he was squaring off with shot an arrow and it glanced off of the butt of his rifle, and it didn't hit Jacob. So Jacob then proceeded to try and fire 2 more times, and his gun misfired on both of those times. And in that amount of time that he tried to refire, the Native American shot 3 more arrows. One of those arrows went through his hat. One arrow grazed the side of his cheek, and I assume just barely drew some blood. And another arrow, the last arrow, went through his satchel. So he didn't get really hit with any of these arrows. And as the story was related to me, none of the militiamen's guns would fire that day. And Jacob Hamblin took this as a sign that he shouldn't use guns to relate with the natives. He should maybe try and go with diplomacy instead. And from that day forward, he was said to have never killed a Native American. Now, of course, the historicity of this is, it was shared by an elder missionary in his, probably in his late 60s, early 70s, and not a historian. And the story of Jacob Hamblin, I'm sure, is far more compelling. I haven't read his biography quite yet. And that will be coming down the pike soon, because there are these certain individuals that are just too compelling to ignore. You just have to get into it. So that's kind of the story behind Jacob Hamblin. He had 4 wives and 24 children over a great span of time. And he lived in this small home kind of on the outskirts of St. George, right on the, I believe it's St. Vrain River. A really compelling story, a compelling guy. And it was really cool. They had in his home, they had Jacob Hamblin's saddle. Now, today, if you're a farmer, you have a ranch, you have, 5, 10, 20, 30 horses, whatever, you have a bunch of saddles and, usually some extra saddles. But back then, saddles were kind of like hats. If you saved up for and you acquired a saddle, that was your saddle. You never parted with that till your dying day. Same with your hat. And they have the Hamblin family I believe it was the 1960s, donated Jacob's saddle to the church, and now it sits inside of his home, and his home is essentially just a museum piece. But it's really interesting, the same elder missionary related the story that there's an ammunition pouch that sits on the side of the saddle. And it's this old leather pouch, just kind of hangs on the left side of it. And he said that Jacob Hamblin never carried ammunition in that pouch after he vowed to never kill a Native American, but it was the perfect size to fit his Book of Mormon, and he said that was the only ammunition that he needed. Just a remarkable person. Here's another interesting story about Hamblin. He built up a reputation with the Native Americans as a fair businessman and who they would talk to if they had problems with the saints. So he was the ambassador, the diplomat, the liaison for the church and for literally European American relations to the Native Americans. And he was commissioned by the John Powell exploratory committee in order to help help with Native relations. He always carried around this red neckerchief, so the natives knew if you see a white man with a red neckerchief, then you don't kill him, because he's coming to to trade and to talk diplomacy. So there's this interesting story about one of his sons. One of his sons went to the native tribe, just south of St. George, across the Arizona border, what is now the Arizona border. Of course, those borders didn't exist in the 1875 or whatever this story would have been. And his son, this young kid, 12, 13 years old, he wanted to prove himself. So his dad said, go to the native tribe and trade this horse and, get some blankets. So his son went down. We're going to call his son Jacob Jr., just for the sake of brevity. So Jacob Jr. goes to this native tribe, and he he bickers back and forth with the native leader, and he said, this is a really good horse. I'm going to need more blankets. I'm going to need more. And eventually the native, the native chieftain just piled up these native blankets, these blankets that they were trading for the horse. He just piled them on top of this kid. And the kid goes back thinking, I really scored a good deal on this one. And he goes back to his dad, Jacob, and says, hey, look at this great deal that I made, with the natives. I was able to get so many more blankets than you thought I could. And Jacob told little Jacob Jr. that, well, that's nice of you, son, but you need to take all but just a few of those back because that wasn't a fair trade. And, of course, Jacob Jr., obeying his father, went back to the native chieftain with his tail tucked between his legs and said, my father sent me back with these because it wasn't a fair business deal. And the native chieftain said, you're Jacob Hamblin's son. I knew you would be back. Because he knew that Jacob Hamblin wasn't going to screw over the chieftain. Now, of course, I'm sure that the historicity of that story is up for dispute as well. As I said, I haven't read Hamblin's biography quite yet, as I will be sometime in the near future. But, it does show kind of like a fantasized, a legendary version of who this Jacob Hamblin was. I'm sure something like this happened. There was a story that happened similar to this, and it spawned and became legendary status. I don't know if there's any way of really knowing, historically speaking. But of course, it does illustrate the overall point that I'm kind of getting at with the whole tour around St. George. The history doesn't seem to matter when there's a good story and a good life lesson buried somewhere in that story. There's that old adage, don't let the facts get in the way of a good story. And I think that is perfectly captured with these various places that I went around St. George, because they're, I don't know. Listening to the stories and how these faithful Latter-day Saints were relating the stories of their prophets and the people that they associated with and the apostles, it's hard to believe that it's accurate, but it's what they believe. It's a story that they were told by the previous missionaries who trained them, their senior missionaries and whatnot. And it was told by the church leaders that this is the story that you tell them. They have a little script. They would pass around occasionally little pictures and whatnot and little cards that had things. And I flipped over the pictures, and that was their script. I don't think you're meant to flip over the pictures, but I did. And it said, relate this story and then talk about how it's, how it has a broader impact on your life. And it was so scripted. Everything was, not memorized scripted, but everything, the stories that they told were, they were told in a way to be a faith-building relationship or a faith-building story. Here's a great example of this. In the Brigham Young house, there was this old wicker chair, and the chair was made by some famous old 19th century furniture maker, and it's an incredibly rare chair and beautiful, absolutely gorgeous. And as the story goes, the chair was essentially disassembled and taken to a dump, and somebody was going to throw it away. This was like in the 1960s or something to that effect. But they had an idea that maybe this chair was, there was something to it. So they took it to I believe it was a furniture appraiser or an antique shop, and they said, yes, this is a chair made by this famous person, and therefore it's essentially a priceless chair. It's invaluable. And the person said, okay, well, let's restore it. And then they donated it to the church. And the sister missionary, this was at the end, the very, very end of the Brigham Young house tour. But the sister missionary there said, it just goes to show you that you can, sometimes if your life is in shambles and everything is just, destroyed, and you feel like you're being cast aside, that you have the ability through the atonement of Christ to rebuild yourself and become, an invaluable chair just like this. And of course, it was much more articulate and emotive the way that she really drove it home. And it just had this powerful illustrative effect of this is an analog for what life is like, and only the church can save you. I've been dealing with that a lot in speaking to these missionaries in visitor centers. Everything always comes back to the church. It's not so much a compelling history and a fascinating narrative. It's much more of, this was a faith-promoting experience, and this is why. And I don't know what else to say about it. I guess it's a little frustrating because I'm always interested in knowing the history, and unfortunately, sometimes stories can really get in the way of learning real history. And but that's all part of this trip, I guess. And that's just going to be a constant contention of mine. And I guess we're going to progress forward from here. But this was the travel log, March 21st, 2017, for the Naked Mormon History Tour. Thank you for listening in.